everywhere. And pulling up his messages. I didn't bother to mute the chat, guys, so we're about to be live. Give me one more second. Pulling these questions up. Okay.
Cheryl's showing the ceiling fan. She's going to start her own hurricane.
Oh, is Cheryl showing video?
Well, it goes in and out.
Hi, Harkins. Hey, Cheryl, if you do look at your screen, there should be a button that looks like a video on it, and that's what I was going to have you click. If you click that, you won't be seen. Or just keep your phone down. I mean, it's no big deal if we see flashing, whatever. No biggie. But, okay, we are live. Hi, Harkins. We're going to be live in 1 second. And actually, I'm just going to go ahead and go live. All right, let's see. They changed a few things on me, guys. Bear with me here. There it is. And, okay. Don't laugh at me, Harkins. Okay, here we go. All right. Oh, you know what? I'm going to do this real quick. Let's put it on Ray. Ray, you get to be the center of attention. All right. Everybody, if you have YouTube open, mute it. All right, thank you. And welcome everyone to Wine Wednesday with the Whisperer. I've got the wine going. I've got lots of awesome people here to chat with and answer your questions. And we've got a doozy for you tonight. Because last week during the stream, I got a very cool message from someone in Canada trying to get the Operation Seahorse Canada going again. And he asked quite a few interesting questions. He brought up the topic that it's very difficult, and Ray has spoke about this many times before, about how it's very difficult to get certain species over the border, or to a different place because of CITES and import-export restrictions. Chris Carey will be joining us when he can from Australia to talk a little bit more about that. He also wanted to know, because he could not get seahorses in very easily, he wanted us to have a little chat about the differences between erectus fry and maybe some of the smaller species or species that have fry that go through the pelagic, however you say it. Correct me, Cheryl. How do you say it? Pelagic. Thank you. Who go through the pelagic phase that need the smaller foods. So he just wanted any tips or tricks. And so I invited my very great friend, Cheryl Taylor, who is a professional breeder and very good, also helps in all the groups, especially Seahorse Sources group. So welcome, Cheryl. Welcome to the show. And why don't you start off, let me just ask you a couple of really quick questions to kind of get the ball rolling. So what kind of differences do you see? I know you've bred many different species. What are the biggest differences between, say, erectus and reedi or any of the others?
Okay, basically erectus they hitch at birth.
Mm-hmm.
They are very small, and they are capable of consuming basically newly hatched brine shrimp that are enriched birth. The pelagic species basically do not hitch at birth, sometimes for 3 or more weeks, and they're basically free swimming.
Gotcha.
And they require preferably a large amount of copepods to be able to survive at least the first 3 days, and sometimes longer, before they are large enough to be able to take baby brine shrimp, newly hatched baby brine shrimp. They're much smaller and they are much more motile.
Gotcha. Actually, and I will put up on screen before I ask you the next question because Cheryl shared a couple of pictures of her setup. So I wanted to show those to you guys very quickly. Let's see if I can find them, of course. Um, and Cheryl, what I'm going to put up is I am going to show, first of all, I'm covering up Ray. Sorry, Ray. I am showing your pot, I believe that I'm showing the picture that has your white containers with and there's four white containers in a row, and then in the back of them are the two blue containers, and it looks to me like a setup for feeds. Is that what it is?
Okay, yes. Those are containers for propagating. You can either propagate rotifers, which are not necessarily your best food source, or you can use them for propagating copepods.
You broke up just a little bit. I know you're on a phone. I'm sorry. Sorry, folks. She's on a phone. We had a little trouble getting started. But what I heard was that you culture different feeds. So you've got culture for rotifers, which are not necessarily the best food, but you can use them. You can enrich them, or you can feed them to the other feeds. Correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Well,
And
I'm
go,
working with Apple Epocyclops panamensis back in 2012,
mhm.
and they're actually reproduce very rapidly. They are uh, about 60 microns at birth, and they're only about 670 microns as adults. They reproduce very rapidly. They are actually one of the few copepods that I've worked with that you can raise on phytopaste.
Ooh.
Uh, yeah, it's a big difference between having to grow out live phyto, and they are also very, very resilient in terms of not having problems with flatworms.
Oh, gotcha. Okay, so lots of benefits just to what we're looking at, guys, are the Apocyclops panamensis. Chad Clayton actually spoke a lot about this in my interview with him, and Cheryl's been working with this pod for a long time, and she's done some really incredible things. And so basically, tell us a little bit more. And I've got the picture of the pods up. I won't keep it up, guys. I just wanted you to see what they look
Okay.
like. And tell us, Cheryl, a little bit more about your setup. How do you said you don't have to do the phyto because they don't need it, right?
You don't have to use live phyto.
Okay,
What you can use with them is live phyto paste.
much
Um,
easier.
yes, yes. And they reproduce very rapidly. Um, if you look at the picture that I sent you earlier, you can see gravid females with the egg sacs on either side, and males, which are in much smaller numbers, that do not have the egg sacs. They reproduce extremely fast.
Awesome. Well, that I think there was one picture I didn't get up, and that was probably the one. So if that's the one, then I will make sure to post it, tag it onto this at the end. I do have a couple others. I did upload, the fry and stuff. I think there was just one that I did miss. So I'll make sure to attach that at the end. But so now, when talking, a lot of people might not, if you haven't set up a culture, if somebody's literally only bred erectus, so they are used to just having to hatch baby brine shrimp, and then enrich the brine shrimp, which is something we really stress. But to do the smaller species really does require these smaller foods that the fry can eat. And you've already explained that you really like the Apocyclops panamensis because of the fact that you can start with phytopaste. And can you tell me, like, is why is that so much easier? Is it just because you don't have to work, like you can replace it if you need to, or how does that work?
The thing is, most couple ponds require live phyto,
Right.
and A. panamensis is the only species that I'm familiar with that you can actually propagate on phytopaste.
Gotcha.
And I started working with them in 2012 and was blown away by how rapidly they would reproduce
That's so
without
the
live
rapid
phyto.
reproduction is huge. I gotcha. And when you said, I'm sorry, did you want to say something else? I'm sorry. Are we good? Okay.
I'm sorry,
Sorry.
repeat that.
I said I'm sorry. I felt like I interrupted you. I apologize. Um,
Now,
okay,
Chad
so
Clayton, Chad Clayton was Reef Nutrition, aka uh,
read
forget his name.
mariculture.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he has worked with them extensively,
Hmm.
and they reproduce at such a massive rate and so rapidly, and they don't require that I raise live phyto. I mean, I went through raising uh, all kinds of phyto for them, and still do not have the success that I've had now.
Wow. So how many? I'm seeing four buckets here. How many do you like? What percentages do you keep? How, tell me about your process for the culturing.
Culturing is actually really easy. You put them in a large container. Uh, the photo that I sent showed some. Actually, I was working with rotifers with at that point,
Okay.
and you siphon them off, run them through a sieve, and feed them out to basically your log of seahorses, and you separate the adults from the newborns.
Gotcha. So the four different containers are when you harvest them to separate the older from the younger, right?
Exactly.
Okay. And is there any like I know it's probably difficult to actually describe it without showing, but is there any how do you know when it's time to harvest? And Sam, I'm sorry, Cheryl. Sam, I'm talking to Cheryl Taylor has joined us tonight, and this is a picture of her set up. We had a question last week about the differences between rearing and raising the fry that actually have to have pods because their mouths are so small. And so we're just discussing with Cheryl Apocyclops panamensis, her culturing techniques, and then I've got Dan and Chris is going to come in a little bit and just discuss the whole situation. We're just talking. So anyhow, Cheryl, I'm so sorry to interrupt. Go ahead. Do you have any key things that you notice or do you have a time limit as to when you harvest or
Uh,
separate?
it depends on the population density.
Okay.
And what I do is I literally siphon them out, run them through a sieve where this basically small enough to keep the adults out of there. They
Mm-hmm.
go back to the propagation system, and then I feed out the basically the nepli,
Mm-hmm.
and they're then to the combs fry.
Gotcha. And is out of the fry that you have raised, were the combs the most difficult for you?
I have been working with combs since 2011.
Wow. Have you had a
And
ton of success or?
I have had success. I've raised them to adulthood. I have managed to get fry from some of the ones I've raised. They are definitely still not the easiest seahorse to raise.
Gotcha.
I love them.
Right, we always like the ones that are not so easy. It's the challenge, I think. And that's what I was telling this gentleman in Canada, that it's different, but it's not necessarily more difficult. And Chris, I did see you. Hello. Hopefully you can jump in if you get a chance because I'd like to hear your opinions too on, because I know you don't raise erectus, and so I'm just curious, if you think it's difficult to raise seahorses when you have the types that need the pods. But it
Well,
really, would you say that it's really just a different situation, but not necessarily that much harder, Cheryl?
I'm here.
Okay, do you think that it's harder to raise them or just different?
They are definitely harder to raise.
Okay.
The biggest success I had with raising homes
Mm-hmm.
was switch to the basically the round tubs. And what I saw in them was they would orient into the flow and snick food as it came by, rather than the square tanks where they were constantly hunting.
Oh,
So
gotcha.
they were basically using substantially less energy to glean food.
So there you go, folks. Tip number one is the round tubs. And Cheryl has talked about, we had an interview with Cheryl prior to this where she explained all this really in a lot more detail too. But yeah, using the round tubs is something that the experienced folks have figured out works better. As you said, Cheryl, because they are more likely to sneak the food out of the water columns in a circular fashion versus hunting constantly. Is that right?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
So the circular
There's
tubs.
another
Go ahead, Dan.
there's another factor too,
I'm going to take down this
and
picture. Go ahead.
the what she said is very true. And almost any species you put in a round tub, that's what you're looking for. Is exactly as she described it. How they're faced into the flow, usually orientated to the light if the light is up top, and the other factor is your flow pattern in the tank in terms of cleanliness. Um, it has a tendency to clean the tank better, and you don't have the dead spots. And it also creates the seahorses to the point where they use less energy and they're able to grow faster.
Absolutely, Dan. Dead on.
Gotcha. Very good tips. Okay, well, guys, what else? What else can we say about raising the smaller fry? Dan, do you have any thoughts about the differences between, say, erectus and reed eye? Any tips you would
Yes.
give someone? Go ahead.
Well, the first thing I think is that the reed-eye fry, I think their immune system is not as robust as the erectus's fry.
Really?
Um, yep. And I think it's more critical with them to keep the tank cleaner and to keep your live foods cleaner. And the problem with raising smaller fry is the first foods. Copepods are ideal. Some people will use newly hatched artemia, and if the artemia is not cleaned up, that can be a huge negative, and the artemia are harder to digest. Rotifers are often used, or historically were often used for trying to raise the pelagic species. The problem with rotifers is basically they're a shell that holds enrichment. The big advantage with copepods, besides being nutritionally correct, is you also get some of the enzymes and some of the beneficial bacteria out of the copepods, which can aid in digestion and in immunity.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, the thing is with rotifers, they really lack the nutritional profile to be able to sustain seahorse fry.
Right.
Uh, and there's been a lot of research done on that. Not only that, seahorse fry really do not recognize rotifers as a food source.
That makes sense too. And now if you're in a situation where they will take rotifers, I understand they don't recognize them and it's not the best bet. But can they be enriched in the same fashion that you could like Artemia, or is it just not the same? Period.
You do enrich the rotifers.
Right.
It's not as long of a period as the artemia,
Okay.
but they're not really digesting it like the artemia does.
Okay, that's
They're
what she said.
basically you're filling them up with enrichment, and basically you may as well be tube feeding the seahorses with enrichment.
Mm.
Yeah.
Wow. So the best bet, I mean, and Cheryl, you're basically your opinion so thus far is that the best bet has been the Apocyclops panamensis, right?
Yes.
And Dan,
The,
I'm sorry, Cheryl, if you were still talking.
the absolute best food for neonatal seahorses that are pelagic is basically it's going to be copepods.
Gotcha. And is that what you use also, Dan? Copepods?
Well, I'm using zooplankton in the same size range that I want them to be.
Right.
By using zooplankton, I'm using multiple species, copepods, different types of shellfish larvae, and a whole plethora of different organisms, much like they do in the wild.
Gotcha. Gotcha.
Bingo.
Go ahead, Cheryl. I'm trying to get Chris a link. Go ahead.
Bingo.
Oh, bingo. That's
Uh,
all you said? Go ahead.
yes.
Okay. Sorry, guys. With this many people, it's hard. Chris, I'll get you that link in 1 second. Um, what else, guys? Sorry. It's hard to have three different people. Go ahead, Dan.
With the reed eye and even the CUDA, a lot of people get them through that initial phase, and they get them to where they think they're doing really well, and then they start the frozen, and a lot of times people will lose them at that point.
Yes.
And you know, again, this is where I think that the immune system and the digestive system of the seahorses aren't as strong as the erectus. Um, and I can't tell you if it's the fast change or if it's bacterial. According to studies that I've read coming out of China, the primary culprit is bacterial enteritis.
Hmm.
And
Bingo.
keeping keeping the frozen food off the bottom is the key with the very young juveniles when you're converting them to frozen. And
Oh,
you almost have to feed and siphon. Um, and you have to have a pretty long overlap of a couple of weeks, or else you're going to run into that problem. I've had whole batches of several hundred and start the frozen training, and then 4 or 5 days later have none.
Hmm.
yeah. The thing
I
is, this is where the probiotics come in, as well as absolute sterility. I mean, when you are raising honeypelagic species, you are have to go through major cleanings several times a day. Uh, It, it's a huge undertaking.
Right, and just in case that
Yeah.
broke up at all for the screen, what Cheryl said is probiotics lend a huge hand because the cleanliness is so important. And she discussed. I'm not trying to repeat your words, Cheryl. I just want to make sure your points get across because they're very good. And she just said that you have to clean multiple times a day, and the probiotics can really help in that situation in keeping the bad bacteria at bay. So yeah,
There,
go
there,
ahead.
there was an interesting study that came out recently out of China. A customer sent me the abstract, and I emailed the one of the researchers, and he sent me the full article. And they were using a lactobacillus species of bacteria,
Hmm.
and they were actually using three different ones, but this one particular species, they found increased the survival rates and the growth rates significantly. And what was interesting was when they were doing the gut analysis in the study, was even though the seahorses were getting the probiotics, the the count of the bad bacteria was actually higher in the probiotic species, but they were non-pathogenic.
Yes.
Wow.
That makes
The probiotics do serve two purposes. The first purpose is keeping the bad guys at bay.
Hmm.
The second purpose is it aids in digestion and breaking down the food.
Well,
well. The
that's
other thing
huge.
too
Go ahead,
that
Cheryl.
it helps the larval seahorses basically develop gut flora that they would not have otherwise. With
Really? That's really interesting. I mean, I didn't realize that that was even, possible. So that's very, I mean, I get it. I just didn't realize that it would do that much. So that's really cool. Um, wow. Well, Is it something that you would not, I mean, like if someone's in a situation, for instance, where they just don't have a choice but to go with certain species, other than the round tub, keeping things clean, using probiotics, um, what else should we maybe discuss? Like, say, sourcing the, best brood stock. Is there anything you have to say in regards to that? All
Oh
right.
God,
She said no.
there's no
Well,
substitute for basically developing your brood stock. Until you bring them up to a higher level, the fry they're going to produce are going to be much smaller. Um, they are going to have lower survival rate. Until you can condition your brood stock, you are not going to have a lot of success.
And what all? I mean, I don't want anybody to give away trade secrets here. This is just a general tips and tricks and conversation in case anybody has questions or wants to hear about this. But is there anything in general that you can say as far as what it takes to condition broodstock, or I mean, can you condition any seahorse that you get? Could you, as a professional, condition that to be brood stock, or does it take actually sourcing good stock and then seeing what's best and kind of having a knack for it, kind of thing?
Right?
combination of the above.
Gotcha,
Yes.
You
gotcha.
know, the Marshall Chang did his thesis on H. reedi, in which what he did was he fed them live foods using live mices, and he fed them just live mycids, and he fed them live mycids that had been
Mhm.
fed with enriched artemia prior to feeding out to the seahorses. And it was interesting that what he found was the live myces by themselves really didn't help anything. But when he enriched the myces with the enriched artemia, he noticed larger fry and higher survival rates.
I have seen exactly.
Now, you go ahead, Cheryl.
I think she was just agreeing.
The
Go
other
ahead.
thing, the other thing that I find interesting is that not all broodstock are equal, just like not all people are equal. So, a smart breeder is going to have a few pairs and be selective. One of those pairs is going to do better than the others, and of course, there's going to be somebody in there that's not going to do as well as the others. So, whenever I'm starting a new species, I'm looking for multiple pairs, not just a pair or a couple of pairs. I'm looking for multiples to hand select the best breeders.
And
Well, the thing is,
go ahead,
as,
Cheryl.
as, they, as they mature, my wild caught pair of combs, when I first got them in the first brood they produced, their fry were very, very tiny and had big eyes and were probably underdeveloped. A year after that, after conditioning them for basically 12 months, uh, they were producing fry that were more than twice the size of what they had originally produced.
Gotcha. I mean, obviously what you guys are doing makes a huge difference. I'm also looking to see what other specific questions we got asked to share them with you guys. But after you have actually, what I was going to ask is, are there times when you think have either one of you ever, or Ray, anyone, have you ever had a situation where you had seahorses that looked really good and you conditioned them and you thought that they were going to be your brood stock and then they did not have good fry? Has that ever happened?
It can happen. Um, I've had some broodstock that just weren't good performers, period. Um, and I've also had others that it seemed like no matter what, they always produced.
Mm.
Um, it That's why I like having multiple pairs. But somebody asked, I think it was Sam Banfield was asking conditioning of broodstock with a question mark. And conditioning of broodstock is basically trying to give them the right diet to do everything as best as they can. Think of it as a athlete that's getting ready to run a marathon. wouldn't be smart for them to eat Twinkies for the next 4 or 5 days before they run the marathon, rather than eating proper nutrition to boost up their energy reserves.
Yeah.
Yeah, but think of the fun you have eating the Twinkies.
Yeah,
Right.
but if the roaches won't eat the Twinkies, then it's probably a good sign we probably shouldn't either.
Right. I get it.
It's one of the, Dan, uh, as you've always said, it's like a king size jigsaw puzzle, and you get one piece wrong, and you lose.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like to think of it as a huge mathematical equation or a long mathematical equation where if one part is wrong, the end answer is wrong. And it's been evident that we can do things differently, but the theme of what we do is essentially the same. Whether we are using a different enrichment, whether we're using a different tank, whether we're using different media for our biological, whether we're using natural seawater versus synthetic, all of that, can play a role. And there's so many things that you really, when I read these studies, I try to analyze them and try to find the underlying information that they're really not telling you to really figure out what's going on. Because just because this study says this is what happens, that without knowing all the details, it's really hard to say, yeah, that's how to do it. Try to find the underlying
Hi,
information that they're
Chris.
really not telling you really about what's going
Hey,
on. Because
mute your YouTube.
this study is what happened, that without knowing all the details, it's really hard to say, yeah,
We're
that's how to do
rehearing
it.
Dan. Got it?
Yes.
Thank you. And Dan, that was actually, it was a good talk. Hey, we wanted to hear it again, I guess. Real quick, I want to welcome Chris, of course. But real quick, one of the questions in the comments you made to CNN was, do you guys learn most of these things? You just pointed out that sometimes the reading the research is good, learning the research is good, but sometimes it's not always 100% correct, or you might find that your experiences are different in this way and that. So, do you learn most of the things that you learn, and Cheryl also, just by by practicing, by continuing to try? Or
I would say it's cumulative. I probably have 60 grand worth of aquaculture books. I've read a lot of articles on other species of raising and other techniques in aquaculture. I do read the studies. I get ideas from all these different things, but then I combine that with what experience I have, and I try to think. Most of what I did initially was thinking through the process, not trying to. Back when I started, everybody was using Chrysals. Nobody used a protein skimmer. I mean, there was a lot of, people used newly hatched Artemia. Nobody sterilized the Artemia. All these things that, I did along the way were from sitting down thinking about it. The Chrysal never ever made sense to me. I couldn't figure out how in the world that was supposed to happen out in the ocean. And, when you look at what happens out in the ocean, why was it a problem in the tank? The air in the belly, I dispelled that from being sucking in air right off the get-go by putting a screen over the tank where they could never get to the surface, and they were plastered to the bottom of the screen with an air bubble.
right.
So, there was a lot of things that I've learned from the studies, but you have to take what comes from that and apply it to your practical knowledge and really think through what you're doing and how things work.
Absolutely. And I have a couple more questions. I found his questions. But Chris, I wanted to welcome you. I know you're on a really tight time limit at work, so I wanted to welcome you real quick. Say hello. And yeah, so you've been on this channel many times. We love you here. But you have experienced the issue with only having access to certain species yourself. So, do you consider the species that you raise difficult to raise?
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, we've got a range of species. So, I think we're raising 5 different species at the moment, and they range from super easy to a royal pain in the butt. So, yeah,
Yeah. Which
it does
which
vary from species to species.
Hey,
I'm so
Chris, I
sorry.
do
Go ahead,
for
Cheryl.
you. Uh, I have not had problems with typhoids or flatworms or any of the other ciliates or anything in my fry tanks for years. But when I first started, I had massive problems. Uh, and I'm not sure what has changed. The ideas.
Were you able to hear all that, Chris?
I sort of heard about half of it.
Okay,
So you were having problems with pests and other variables.
yeah, she's on
Um,
she's on a phone. Sorry, she said she had a lot of trouble at first with say flatworms and just different problems like that. And now she doesn't have any of those problems, and she's just wondering what you might think changed so that she's not having these problems now. Like we're thinking of someone new starting having all these problems and maybe how to avoid it.
yeah.
We'll definitely just quarantine from the outset. Make sure that you're not introducing any pests or anything that's going to cause problems. It's not always the easiest thing to do because they find their way of slipping in. But if you're very, very strict from the outset, it
Yeah.
very much narrows or limits the potential for bringing unwanted, undesirable organisms in.
I mean, I'm going back 15 years ago, and I would have hydroids and all kinds of problems. It's been probably at least 12 or 13 years since I've had problems with hydroids or anything else. But since then, I've become meticulous with my nurseries and how I set up the systems. And I'm thinking that may be a big factor.
That
Yeah, I'd
it
say that's
that
probably the thing.
I'm so sorry. I was just gonna say that's really a really good question because hydroids to me and I don't know as much as you guys do, but they just seem to come out of nowhere. I mean, I've had them show up in tanks just because like maybe I was overfeeding a bit, but there was nothing new, and I'd had the tank running for 2 years, and all of a sudden hydroids. And I do know they can come in on like feeds on brine shrimp and all that kind of stuff, but how is it just the meticulous care that's keeping her clean now, you think?
It's meticulous care. I haven't seen hydroids in my tanks in my nurseries in years. And it's about basically being meticulous about your cleaning as far as I'm concerned.
I
Uh,
think you're absolutely right. I think you're right. And do you guys, do any of you, Chris, I know I'm trying to get to a few questions for you, but do any of you guys have any thoughts, tips, anything you can say about keeping the hatcheries clean? Like, is there anything in the very general that you like? Is it something you is like A1 priority and needs to be cleaned on a daily, or with pods is that different? That kind of thing. Anybody? No.
Well,
Okay. Go ahead.
every single batch that we do, after every use, each vessel, each airline, everything is cleaned with soap and water, followed by hydrogen peroxide.
yes.
Each batch. Wow. But now with
Yes.
but with pods it's different, right? Because with I'm thinking like
Well, yeah. If you're raising pods, it's a little bit different. In my case, I'm not raising them; I'm holding them. Um,
gotcha.
but if you're raising pods, you need to change out your containers periodically, and they need to be cleaned and sterilized before you reuse them.
Yeah, it sound
And
it.
I
Sorry.
clean everything with hydrogen peroxide between each use, and I sterilize any brine shrimp I use prior to feeding with hydrogen peroxide. And
Hydrogen peroxide is the key. I absolutely agree. Were you still speaking? I'm sorry. Guess not. Okay. Sorry about that, Cheryl. Okay, well, Chris, really quick, because I know, like I said, I know you're on a time limit. Um, Out of this, when you're in a situation where you have limited choices as far as species, and you want to get a breeding establishment going, like, and I'm thinking of actual companies, maybe not hobbyists, but um, what species is the easiest? Do you think? Like in your situation, I know everybody's is different, but when you said you have from very easy to very difficult, what's the easy and what's the difficult?
The easiest species for us is our belly seahorse or the abdominalis, but that match to our location down here in Tasmania, it's nice and cold. So temperature isn't a problem here. Whereas if you're in a lovely, nice, warm, tropical part of the world, which I'd be really jealous of this time of year, you're going to have a lot of trouble keeping a temperate species like that. So a tropical species would be much easier in that case. But due to the size of the babies of the potbellies, when they come out, they'll go straight onto Artemia. Much easier to deal with. But when you're dealing with multiple stages of food, when you're dealing with predators and copepods and other feeds like that, and then you have to eventually wean them onto the bigger live food, and then after that you have to wean them again onto a frozen food. It's a big pain in the butt.
Yeah.
Yes, I do have a question for you. Because basically what I do with breakfast and some of the other species,
Hey
I wean.
Cheryl, I can
Yes,
I can hear you're trying to say something, but I can't hear you at all. I don't know if they can, but try to
okay.
like talk next to the phone or something maybe.
Is this better?
Yes.
Okay. Chris, basically, I do not wean them onto larger prey and then onto frozen. Typically, when I work with my erectus and actually my combs also, I wean them directly from basically directly onto shaved mysis. And I wanted to see if you had tried that.
Onto live masters, did you say?
Basically, I do not wean them onto live or large brine shrimp. I start them at about 6 weeks onto shaved tiny bits of shaved mysis.
Yeah, so that's a frozen food though. So that's what I mean. Like you know,
Okay.
the mysids, however they're prepared, are still a frozen food. Um,
Yeah, I try
so
frozen.
some of the ones that we have, they need to be weaned multiple times, which is why they're such a pain in the butt.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um,
Oh, I see what you're saying. So when you say weaned multiple times, you mean because you're going from the small food to the big food, then to the frozen or whatever. Wow, yeah, that'd be kind of
yeah, so
sucky.
you can't keep them on such a small food from that they start on from the outset. They won't sustain on that until you can get them frozen foods. So you need to intermediate with another slightly larger, more you know, suitably sized live food. So it's a pain in the butt.
Yeah, sounds like it. And I've heard, I
Yeah.
actually, it's interesting. I've heard from multiple people that abdominalis is I mean, even here, that abdominalis is the easiest seahorse to keep, raise, etc., as long as you can keep up with the temperature. So interesting that you happen to mention that. So when you're in a situation like this, though, I mean, there's just no other way, right? Do you see any end coming, like to the restrictions and such, where the trade might change, or do you think it's going to be certain species in certain areas long term? Just your
Just
Is
thoughts.
that like side
to
or
accept
Yes, I'm
frozen
sorry. I
food.
think everybody's talking. Sorry. Yeah, I wasn't. I know you can't tell me what the law is going to be, and you can't do that. I just wondered if your projected thoughts is that basically it's going to stay this way, where if someone's in a situation where they can't access erectus, they might as well move on to a different species. I mean, is that what you see the soon to be foresee future?
I would love to say that the regulations will open up, and like our case in Australia is we can't access Erectus, so we haven't got Erectus to play with. I see lots of pictures and videos of people with lovely Erectus on the Seahorse group, and I'm a little bit jealous. I'd love to be able to have a crack at keeping and raising them because they're big, beautiful seahorses and quite easy from the sounds of things, but we're stuck with what we've got here in Australia, and many other countries that will also be the case. And we may have some seahorse species here in Australia that you guys don't have access to over in America and all over other places of the world. So we're doing our part to try and widen the amount of variety available in the seahorse trade. But I think ultimately we'll come to a point where the hobby isn't big enough to support a certain amount of species, and it will naturally find its way of limiting that. There's only so many keepers out there. It's such a niche sort of hobby or fragment of the hobby. And I mean, ultimately, if we could expand the amount of seahorse keepers around the world, and there was more support there, and there were more people to take on more different species, then it might eventually get to a point where it's worthwhile for us to expand the range of seahorses that we offer, and other people like Dan, might take on more species, or different seahorse keepers and breeders will take on more different species, perpetually maintain more species in the hobby. But I think at the moment we're somewhat limited by the market, if that makes sense.
No, it does. And actually, Ray, I know you've been so patiently listening this whole time. I'm just curious because the gentleman that was asking me the questions about all of this was looking into working with Seahorse Canada. I'm not going to say any names or anything besides that, but the bottom line is there a market there? I'm just asking your opinion.
I had a lot of trouble selling my seahorse. Now with the dwarfs, you could sell them no problem at all. But when it came to the reed eye and Aractus, I had a lot of trouble selling them off.
Really?
Yeah.
And I'm
Really?
curious because I didn't have a chance to ask you yet. I'm sorry. I think Cheryl was trying to ask a question, but so you actually bred reed eye and different species? What was your routine for the reed eye? Anything in particular, or just basically what everybody else is saying?
A long time ago, and I actually tried a few different things with the reed eye at first, and wasn't successful. And believe it, when when I excuse me a sec here.
I'm sorry. You want me to move on for a sec?
When I first started being successful, it was when I'd divide them up about 150 to 1 gallon jars. That's Canadian gallon, not US gallon. And so I had 12 of those sitting on a shelf, and there's no system at all. I just change out the water every other day and start them off with enriched rotifers, because for me that was the easiest thing, and I didn't have any copepods at the time. And the rotifers, I fed them on water that I made up out of the spirulina powder from Brine Shrimp Direct. And then for enrichment, I used the Algamac, I think it was 2000 back then.
There's a very good question that I'm going to ask right before we get off, because I know Chris didn't want to can't not that he didn't want to, but that he doesn't do the feeding at his facility. So I do want to talk more about the DHA. But I'm sorry. Go ahead and finish.
If I could interject for a moment,
Absolutely,
Ray,
Cheryl.
you did a fantastic job of bringing along your read
She watched you.
Absolutely amazing work that you did. And I'm going back years ago. And my hat is off to you, sir.
She's talking to you, Ray. If you couldn't hear her very well, she said you did an amazing job.
I didn't hear that either.
I'm
My
sorry.
warning thing just come on.
Uh-oh. Okay. Well, she said you did an amazing job with the reed eye. So you should not say any different because she watched your experience through the forum and you did a really great job with your reed eye, and she said her hat is off to you, sir.
She didn't see my 9 failures before I started being successful,
I think that's the truth of anybody. Go feed your seahorses, Ray. I'm going back to Chris for a minute.
though. Okay.
uh,
We're going back
Go ahead,
years
Cheryl.
ago on seahorse.org, and his work on reed eye and the information he imparted was phenomenal.
Well, I have to say to each and every one of the people sitting here that every single one of you have made everything that I have ever done possible because of all the work and effort you guys put in, and the fact that you're still willing to come and sit and answer questions and talk about this. My hat is off to each of you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And what was I going to ask you, Chris? Oh gosh, I had the perfect question. I lost it. Oh, so I just wanted, actually, it's not really a question. I just wanted to mention that if anyone interested in seahorses that is in a situation where they're having trouble with CITES, that Seahorse Australia, which Chris can help you with, can
Yeah.
and will work with you. They can. They're one of the few places I believe in the world that can actually ship seahorses in regard, in spite of the CITES regulations. So because you're CITES registered, right? Um, what's it called?
Yeah. It's something like that. We're a CITES certified seahorse farm or something along those lines. Rochelle's all in the know with that.
Right. And I'm not trying to put you on the spot. I was just saying anybody who's that you should call Seahorse Australia because they can likely help you or whatever, give you more advice. um, but anyways, okay. So where were we? What's going on with Seahorse Australia, Chris? I just wanted to check in with you. Everything going good there? How's the restaurant going?
Yeah, good, good. Super, super busy. So I haven't been on very much recently because we've got lots going on and lots of things happening, lots of good things, and um, keeping me busy.
I bet. And no worries. And if you have to jump off here anytime, please feel free. We appreciate you coming. If someone did approach you and just ask, for any type of general tips or tricks in raising the reed eye or cuda, is there any? Would you tell them to choose one or the other? And would you have any general tips for someone that was looking to do that, whether it be a hobbyist or whoever?
I would just say, pick the seahorse that you obviously like or you're passionate about. I think it's a very personal choice. I don't think it's necessarily a case of, this one's easier than the other, because that will also come down to personal preference or experience a little bit sometimes. Some seahorses are definitely harder than others. I don't actually personally raise the cuda. Um, my main focuses at the moment are the abdominalis, the whitey eye, and the reed eye. And there's a few others that I'm having a little bit of a play with, but not having great success. So until I can scale things up a bit, it's just those main 3 species that I'm working with. But Rochelle and the others are doing Cuda and Barbari.
Hey, Chris, you ought to check out hippocampus combs.
She loves hippocampus combs. She will always say that.
Totally addicted.
You are the combs queen, I swear. um, it. I'm really interested in the fact that you have whitey eye going and that they're doing well. Are they similar to any other species, or why do you think you're having such success with them?
Um, they're very, very different from any
Yes.
other species that I've worked with. They're probably one of the better species to work with, in my opinion, but I'm biased. I think we're having success with them uh, purely based on obviously experience. I'm probably maybe the second most experienced with those of the species that I work with. but also because we're probably the only ones with them. So, to my knowledge, there's no one else in Australia that is keeping or breeding them on any sort of a scale. And by extension, there's probably no one else in the world that's keeping or breeding them. So,
Right.
and they're heavily protected by CITES, and they're listed as an endangered species here in Australia. So no one should really have any luck with the department trying to even get any broodstock from the wild. We recently had one of our applications rejected to get more broodstock from the wild for breeding purposes for the
Oh.
aquarium trade.
Well,
Chris,
I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Oh, go ahead, sure. Real quick, I want to say I'm really sorry to hear that they're not doing well in the wild, and it makes me even more glad that you are working with them because that might, I mean, not just for your establishment, but also just in general, so we don't lose the species. And Cheryl, what were you going to say?
Chris, you want to get blown out of the water? Work with hippocampus engines.
Ooh, have you ever worked with engines?
I
No, so
have.
we don't have access to comies or engines or
Oh,
erectus. So a lot of the
yeah.
species that you guys have, we can't actually legally bring into Australia. So I'm very jealous.
My God. They grow to, they're grow almost as big as pots. And the fry they will produce even young seahorses, several thousand fry that are smaller than an eyelash.
Uh,
They will blow your mind.
Well, I think it's a darn, you know, I wish things were different and I wish that, you know, everyone had access to everything. But I think what, you know, the fact that, Chris, that you guys took species that might not be the easiest or sometimes are. I just think what you're doing is a great thing and that you in spite of the restrictions, you still are making a huge difference and you know
Yeah.
I just really thank you so much and please keep up the good work. I did understand what you were saying about, you know, it's such a niche hobby. So that's why everybody needs to, you know, keep sharing the message and keep getting the word out there
Yeah.
so more hobbyists do and more you know companies and such do start working together to get us the species. I mean, I would love to see sublingatus and oh my gosh, whitey eye, are you serious? Oh my gosh, that'd be so cool. But I get it, you know, it takes a lot to bring them in and it takes a lot to ship them. It's a difficult thing. But so is Seahorse Australia kind of focusing? I know you said the three species you're doing, and that they're doing some others. And are you guys looking at? I know you guys were working with. Well, guys, we'll get back to the feeds in just a second. I just wanted to touch base with Chris. Are you guys still doing any other projects? You know, the handfish and such.
Hey,
Yeah, so we've still got the handfish projects on the go. So we've got heaps of things on the go. Um, and so yeah, once things settle down a little bit and uh, things probably won't realistically settle down, we'll probably just change our focus from one thing to another. So instead of, you know, dropping a project and things getting actually easier over time, we'll probably just pick up other projects when we drop off one. So we'll always stay busy.
Yeah, I
hey,
mean,
I do
you know what? Putting too
think
much on your plate is a bad thing too. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Cheryl.
uh, you're an Alice, right?
I don't think we
You're an
got.
Alice. Yeah.
What was that one? Sorry.
You are you familiar with the Stada?
It's breaking up
Sorry, I'm
completely, Cheryl. I'm
not getting
sorry.
any.
Which are crested cockatoo?
Hey, you know what, Cheryl? Can you type the question in the message? I'm sorry, something's not coming through. So well, I'm so
It's okay. It
sorry.
was out on the table. One of my favorite cockatoos.
I think she said cockatoo. I'm not sure. Okay,
Uh, the big birds that raise their crests.
what were you asking about them, Cheryl?
I was just curious if you were familiar with any of them.
Oh, she wants to know if you're familiar with them.
Yeah, so we have a
Okay.
range of different cockatoo species around here. There's white ones, there's the red tail and yellow tail black cockatoos. There's a whole range of different bird species down here.
That's awesome. And Sam is in the comments too, and she mentioned handfish is one of the species being bred by Chris and Tassie. Right. That's I actually had the honor of talking with Rochelle and owe her a huge debt and article and etc. But we'll pretend we didn't. We'll pass that by. Anyhow, no, I got to talk to her and I got to learn a lot about that Sam, and they're doing some really amazing things there, and that's why I brought it up. So absolutely. But yeah. Okay. Well, I'm going to ask now about the feeds a little bit, Chris. So please feel free to pipe in. But I know if you have to jump off, feel free. And if you want to, is there anything else you wanted to share, like as far as thoughts, trip tips, tricks, anything?
Um, Probably one of my biggest personal ones would be to document everything that you do. So, for example, at work, I've got an aquarium diary, and like I've had an aquarium diary at work since I started working at Seahorse World, and all I do is I document down every single day something happens or anything of note. I take notes on everything with how each individual batch of fry is going, and then that way you can always look at those back at those notes and basically give yourself feedback based on what you're doing and what's working and what's not.
Mhm.
And then you can keep track of say the numbers of each batch of fry that you get. If you count each batch of fry that you get, count the numbers, and then see how many you get through to
Curious.
survive at the end, and then trial different things based on that feedback, and eventually keep improving over time. You'll find that those personal records that you're keeping are of huge benefit to you later on.
Can you post some information on the filtration that you are using?
I heard. Can you something seahorses on filtration? Sorry. Try going right up to the phone, Cheryl.
Okay.
Sorry.
I'm just always looking for new ways to improve my skills.
Okay, I think okay, she said she's looking for new ways to improve in her skills, and I think she asked about filtration tips. Is that right, Cheryl?
Hmm.
Yeah. So is there that Chris? That was an excellent tip that we often forget to bring up. Is keeping a journal. That's so great. That's such. I'm so glad you said that because we all do it, but it's something people typically forget to mention is all their notes and records. So anything about filtration that you have thoughts about,
Okay.
Chris?
Just basically have good flows, good filtration. Um, my thoughts on filtration are slightly different due to the way our facility is set up. So, for example, I have probably more access to salt water than almost anyone else that I know
Mhm.
or anyone else in the hobby. So basically, I do large, significant water changes, which most people, it's not really a viable option for. So
Right.
basically, I can do a 80% water change on just about any given system at drop of a hat, and it'll be temperature controlled and matched to the system. So, but I know that most people don't have access to that sort of, they
Mhm.
haven't got the salt water just sitting there ready to go whenever they're ready. So, um, the way that I do things is probably very different to how a regular hobbyist would do it, or even a lot of other facilities.
You're using natural seawater then.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't live near the coast, so I don't have that access.
Right, me either. I know that that's one thing I'm jealous of from you because man, that's very cool that you can do that because nature, natural. Shoot, come on, that's probably one of the best if you can pull it off. But yeah, did you have
One,
anything else you wanted to ask Chris, Lucy, or Cheryl? Sorry.
yeah, one question. How are you sterilizing the natural seawater that you're bringing in?
What? Sorry.
If you're able to tell us, if it's not something that you're not able to tell us, do you sterilize the water coming in?
Yes, definitely. So it goes through, I think, 3 or 4 different layers of filtration, and it also goes through UV, and it's being treated on many different levels
Right.
before it gets stored. And we've got like vast storage capacity.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah,
Always been
Definitely.
intrigued. I don't live on the coast, but I keep thinking about moving there, and it probably will never happen, but I would love to.
If you move there, take me with you. I want to go and hang out with Chris and Sam. I'm sorry, U.S. people, I'm leaving you if I can. But we would start a Seahorse Whisperer in Australia, right? No, I'm just kidding. Anyways, agreed, Cheryl, because man, it'd be pretty darn cool, especially to, yeah, take me with you, please.
Harkins asked, sorry, Kelly.
No, please,
Harkins
please.
asked the question, how often you do water changes, Chris?
every day.
Not surprised. And when you got the water there, I mean, why wouldn't you to take care of all of the that makes perfect sense. And yeah, I did want to mention too that I saw somebody, Sam. I'm sorry if I misread your question when you were talking about the handfish, but yeah, it's a pretty fascinating story. There's lots of articles already up about it, and I'm trying to get one up myself. But they're working with actually saving them from the wild, certain species, and really doing a really amazing job and amazing things there. So definitely look that up. I'll try to find a few articles when I'm done and link them, but very cool things they're doing there. Um, and then, yeah, Chris, did you have anything else? I don't want to move forward unless if you had something else you wanted. Any tips? Any thoughts? I'm
How
like,
often do you do
I'm trying to pull them
changes?
from you. What'd you say, Cheryl?
How often do you do water changes using natural seawater?
He said every day, I think, right?
Yeah, every single day. So because we've got such good access to salt water, the way our
And how
facility is set up, we've also got access to different temperatures of seawater. So our natural reservoir is chilled down to a certain temperature. So we've got cold salt water basically on tap, and we've
yeah.
got heated tropical salt water on tap as well. So it makes it very easy for dealing with water changes to multiple different types of tanks. And we've also got mixers on various setups, so we can basically get a mixture of tropical and cold salt water, so we can basically make it come out at almost any temperature we need realistically.
And do you worry about it when you're doing this at all?
I didn't
Well,
catch that one, sorry.
Do you worry about SG, your specific gravity?
Um, a
I don't
little
think
bit.
it's a problem.
I'm very aware of what our specific gravity is, but um, it can fluctuate because we're taking salt water from a natural source. So, for example, this time of year in winter, if we have large seasonal, like larger than average rains, it does affect our salinity, and our salinity starts to drop. And we actually do notice that there's a notable change in the color of the salt water as it comes out. It starts to get a bit of a greenish tinge to it
Mm-hmm.
due to tannins and other impurities in the water.
All right. Okay. I'm tracking. I'm just running it through my brain and trying to improve everything that I'm doing. Uh,
sure. And once we get him here, we got some. We always got somebody. Go for it, Cheryl. You got him.
uh,
Fire away.
I'm always looking for a way to improve what I'm doing. 15 years and I'm still trying to figure out a better way to do it.
You never stop learning, so always try and improve wherever you
Yeah.
can.
Yeah.
Chris, I
Anyway,
don't know if I'm allowed to ask this. If not, just give me the cutthroat sign. But the question you asked me, did you ever get anywhere with it? The freezing the
No,
macros? No.
no, I didn't. I did try it, but another staff member cleaned up after me, and
Didn't
yeah, so
work.
I have to start again.
Okay,
Um,
well, please keep me
the
informed. I want to
question,
know.
yeah, the question that I asked Kelly, so everyone else is in the loop.
Yes.
I was asking her if macroalgae can survive being frozen. So, for example, um, if you take macroalgae from the wild and it gets put in a freezer, and you take it out of the freezer and put it into one of your tanks, will it survive that? Will it not get the cells damaged from
Yeah.
the ice?
I,
Um,
I quarantine mackerel for 6 months minimum in a
Yeah.
separate tank, and then I consider adding one of my tanks.
Right. Cheryl made the point, in case anybody didn't hear, that she quarantines macroalgae always for 6 months before she even considers putting it in her tank. Very good point. But me and Chris were having a little side bet kind of thing, trying to see if certain species, like when he asked me if macroalgae could be frozen, my instant thought was no because of the cells. I remember when I spoke with Chad at Reef Nutrition about his Fido, that they freeze it, but it has to do with them having the capability of putting those cells in like a quiescent state was his word. And so I don't know how that would be, how well that would work with the larger, multi-celled algae. And so we just had a running kind of, we're trying to figure it out. So if anybody knows or has tried, good night, Ray. If anybody knows or has tried, please pipe up. Feel free. Have you ever tried to
Yeah.
freeze it, Cheryl?
No, I've never tried freezing it, but my primary go-to for my tanks is going to be Calipara maxifolia, and that is actually a warm water species, and I sincerely doubt if it would handle freezing.
Mm.
Never tried freezing it.
That's what
Um,
Sam said in the comments. Wouldn't the cell walls burst? But I don't know. I really could see Chris pulling this off somehow. I just could
some people
watch.
might be, some people might wonder why you might want to freeze macroalgae. There's two different reasons. So you might want to freeze it as part of a quarantine process. So if you
yeah.
were to freeze it, you would likely kill off, you know, undesirable organisms that might come in on it. So it could be part of a quarantine process. But the main reason why I want to basically take macroalgae that's been frozen is it actually comes in as part of some of our food. So it'll occasionally come in with some of our mycids and other stuff.
Mhm.
And so I'm trying to see if I can, you know, defrost it and bring it back and use that as a method of sourcing it and getting different macroalgae going.
I'm curious from both of you. Do any of you use live amphipods with your feed your seahorses?
Good
We
question.
use live amphipods, but not for our seahorses at the moment. So we're actually sourcing live amphipods for our handfish.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Um, but yeah, there's a lot of work in that.
Yeah, seahorses love amphipods, and I have a source for aquaculture amphipods, and I do buy them and feed them out on a regular basis.
Is
I'm
it
just
just personal? I mean, is it just what you've chosen as your regimen, Chris? Is there any particular reason you don't, or is it just not what you do?
So the main reason why we're feeding it to the handfish and not the seahorses is because we're struggling. Like it's too much work to get it for the handfish as is,
yeah.
let alone like we've got so many seahorses that it would be unsustainable for us to try and get that many amphipods for the seahorses, as
Uh,
well as the amphipod species that we actually get are too large for the snouts of the seahorses. I mean, you can get baby versions of the same amphipods, but once they reach a certain size, they're actually too large for the seahorses that we deal with.
well, I'm a hobbyist, and the
Sure,
amphipods I get, the maximum size is about a quarter of an inch, so they're not that big.
sure.
But it
Yeah,
depends on the species that you're getting.
yeah, so we're based down here in Tasmania, and the stuff that we have access to down here will be very different from people even on the mainland of Australia, let alone over in America or other places like that. And just quickly going back to the macroalgae, that's also the reason why I asked, is because um, people in America, people in warm tropical areas even, probably won't have any luck with macroalgae, but down here in Tasmania, we're as close as you can reasonably be to Antarctica without, getting cold and being surrounded by penguins. So, you know, because we're very cold water down here, I think there's a good chance that maybe the macroalgae around here might be, uh, more tolerant of processes like being frozen.
Yeah.
Does make sense, and I really can't wait to see how it works out, because you could come up with some species that we've never seen before, and it would be so great, so great.
Yeah,
I'm so excited. So please keep us updated on that for sure. Uh,
I was I was having a chat last night, or the night before actually, with a seahorse keeper down here, and she was saying how jealous she is of all the macroalgae that you guys have access to over in America.
right.
She's really jealous of some of the beautiful types that you guys have that once again we just don't have access to.
Yeah.
And you know
Well,
what? I have I'm sorry, Cheryl. It might be a good silly question, but are macros under some sort of, like, can't they be sent overseas, or not overseas? I mean, you know what I mean. Can they be passporters? Go ahead, Dan.
They're they're restricted in many places. You got to know the rules and the regs on that to be able to ship them.
Okay, well then I won't ship them. But I just Chris hit me up on the side, you know. But anyways,
Many species are considered invasive, and they don't. It's like California
right,
really limits what goes into their state, and Hawaii, anything that's live has to go through their Department of Agriculture for inspection.
well, the thing
right,
is with Oz too, they have very strict limitations on what can be exported, and
right.
so you guys are in a very different world. I was working with a research facility in Malaysia, and they bought over 300 seahorses. They were doing an experiment, and all of a sudden they came back at me and said, "What do we do? Seahorses are dying." Well, and I told them, I said, "You guys have tail rot," and they came back and sent me a very high-powered video of ciliates, and they refused to buy antibiotics. And I came back to the reason the ciliates are there is they're feeding off and proliferating off the necrotic tissue from the tail rot. They finally came back and said, "We got the antibiotics." I sent them the actual chemical formulas, and they came back and said 3 days later, everybody's healing. And I was like banging my head against the wall.
Mm.
They
And could they not get the antibiotics, or they just wouldn't?
they did not understand that the affiliates were there because of tail rot.
They thought it was from the seahorses. I gotcha. That sucks. That really
Absolutely blew.
sucks.
This is a research facility.
That's unbelievable, really. Um, well, I did want to make sure. I know it's getting late, guys, so I wanted to make sure that I did get to this point. So I'm going to ease into it with one last question for you, Chris. Another one that might or might not be allowed. I know you don't do the, feeding. You know you love me. I know you don't do the feeding process, and we can't share, feeding regimens and such. But in general, you've said you don't use the amphipods for the seahorses. You've talked a little bit about how your circumstances are just different because you've got the water and etc. Um, do you, when you're not selling the seahorses, when we're just talking strictly about breeding and getting them to the point where you might start going on to frozen to get them ready for sale or whatnot, is pods mainly what you use, or what are you allowed to tell me, like the specific animal you typically use, or no?
I don't think I'm allowed. No.
Okay, fair enough. I appreciate your honesty. I mean, it come. We got it. When things work, you got to do them the way you do them. I hear you. Okay, well then I'm gonna direct. If you have anything else you do want to say, please feel free to interrupt, pipe up, feel free. Dan, the question actually was that, and this is actually to anybody, but I'm asking Dan because he uses Dan's feed. So the question was, he posted his comments last week, but it didn't show up in the stream for some reason. Um, he's learning a lot and trying to learn about the enrichment processes because they just seem to be a little different when we're talking about Artemia versus copepods, and obviously they are. He said he's very good with Artemia. He uses Dan's feed and liquid easy DHA, and to be completely honest, he was just doing that because that's what worked and etc. But now he's trying to go on the forums and learn about enriching when it's different foods, and it's very confusing because the forums, how it is. One person says one thing,
Yep.
one person says. So what do you think about, what would you advise?
Well, the copepods don't specifically need enriching; they need to be fed properly.
Okay.
Yes.
They're not trying to bring up their certain values or corrective values. Copepods are considered naturally in the correct value um, for feeding. The Artemia is different because Artemia is rich in protein, but it's lacking in the fatty acid profiles.
Yeah.
And it's compounded by the fact that Artemia rapidly catabolizes DHA back down to EPA. And seahorses cannot convert the lower chain fatty acids back up. So you're trying to up the content of the DHA and the Artemia before you feed them out to the seahorses.
Basically, with Artemia, you need to, depending on the size of them, you need to enrich them for a minimum of 4 hours, up to 24 hours, depending on the age of the Artemia, to bring the HOKs up to an acceptable level.
Right. And so
Agreed.
yeah. Go ahead.
Agreed. Adult Artemia don't need as long. They will pack the gut typically in 2 hours.
Yeah.
So if you feed them or try to enrich them for 2 hours, the gut's packed. If you go 4 hours, they then assimilate what's in the gut and repack the gut.
Yes.
Nauplii, on the other hand, particularly in star 2, 3 uh, areas, there it takes roughly 12 hours to pack the gut. So
Exactly.
we enrich for 24 hours because they'll pack the gut and then they will assimilate some of that and repack the gut. If you go past 24 hours, Artemia don't digest fats well. And what happens is they get clogged up with the fats and then they start dying off after 24 hours.
Exactly. Exactly.
Gotcha. And yes, right. That last week we were actually talking. I think that might have even confused people more possibly because we were talking about whether or not Artemia was considered nutritious for seahorses. Great discussion last week. Go check it out. We won't go through it again. But the answer is they are, just different. And Dan just explained it at length and very well, about the DHA and et cetera, and how enrichment takes care of that. And with copepods, they already have what's needed. He's already said it all. I won't repeat it. But so what do you, is the basic advice that with copepods, you're better off either collecting or purchasing on a feed basis, or I mean, I know Cheryl cultures them, so, but do most breeders not?
I
Well,
typically purchase my copepods in large numbers, and I harvest off the newborn neck live for uh, very tiny newborn seahorses, and the larger ones I let them go ahead and reproduce.
Gotcha.
the problem for most people is having enough copepods. If you sit there
Right.
and watch the fry, when I
Yeah.
have copepods that I'm putting in the tank, and I sit there and watch the fry, I see them eat up to 2 food items per minute.
Oh
Now,
yeah.
If you multiply that out, because they're in the pelagic phase, I leave the lights on 24/7. So if they're eating just, let's just say one per minute, that means they're going through 60 in an hour.
Mm.
Multiply that times 500, and then multiply that times 24. And, I generally figure I have to estimate it, but when I collect plankton, I'm trying to collect roughly 1 million food items per tank per day. And to
Huh.
get that kind of production, you need roughly a 1,500-gallon copepod tank in order to have that type of production. And then you need an algae room with massive amounts of algae, microalgae, to support feeding them.
The thing is, you cannot raise enough copepods in a home environment to sustain a large number of pelagic seahorse fry. It's just not possible.
So, Cheryl, saying that, do you just limit your production? Is that how you, I mean, of actual seahorses, or I mean, how are you able to do it?
Yeah, you have to cull the seahorses because you cannot raise enough copepods to raise a whole boatload of engines or foam or red eye or any of the other pelagic species.
Well, there are people who do raise reed eye without using copepods, and they use newly hatched artemia instead.
Yeah,
Okay.
And the difference is the percentages of survival are drastically lower. But if you're good enough, you can get some through to the point to where they can take enriched artemia.
yes, agreed.
Well, I think
Yeah,
I think Ray left, and that's I think his computer died. But I am so bad about understanding locations and what locations are accessible to or have access to. But like in if you're in Canada, say, uh, is collection even a possibility? I don't know.
Summer months
Water
along the coast, the
summer
problem
months.
is,
Okay.
yeah, if you go up to, for example, let's say New York along Long Island Sound, there's been research that's been done up there using copepods and raising seahorses, but it has to be limited to certain times of the year because of the water temperatures and the plankton levels drop during the winter months.
Ah. So you really got to know your stuff is the bottom line, or try
yeah,
the the baby artemia, but it just doesn't sound like that's a really successful option if someone's trying to do business.
Yeah. Well, down here, when I was collecting, I was working with Adelaide Roads, and I was also working with Ericston at Algagen, where we were taking samples and analyzing them. And different times of the year, we had different things. This time of year, if I was collecting plankton, about 50% of what I would collect would be barnacle larvae.
Hmm.
Um, you won't see that in the winter months, and you'll see different species of things as the seasons progress.
And wait, barnacle larvae is good, right?
Well, the seahorses tore it up, so
Okay, all right.
I did occasionally get some barnacles that would develop in pipes and stuff that I would have to attend to, but you'd never see barnacles in the tank itself.
Gotcha. And Sam, I know Sam has also been on the show, and she's made some comments in the comment section. Be sure to check those out if you watch later. But she was talking in the interview and in the comments about how she would collect hers. But and when it comes to collection, also, I just want to note this for anyone who happens to be a hobbyist or just starting out. When it comes to collection, um, unfortunately, I don't have a picture of Dan's huge collection contraption, but he has one. It's a big, huge collection contraption thingy. And ask him in Seahorse Sources group. He'd be happy to show you, I'm sure. But the bottom line is, and for Sam, she lived in an area where the water was different than it might be here. So, we've had a lot of discussions about natural salt water. Tonight we discussed, Chris discussed a little bit how his water goes through multiple filters and UV and sterilization. And a big question when you talk about collecting feeds is, uh, you know, how can you make them clean? How can you make sure that they're not contaminated or having a problem? And I just want to make that note that, the people talking about collecting usually have a method or they live in an area where the water is very good and not a problem. So anybody can feel free to argue with that or contribute to that, but that's my 2 cents. Is just be careful. Is my point. If you don't know,
Well,
go ahead. Go ahead, Dan.
in talking with Adelaide, who is a researcher for copepods, my thought process was not to collect anything over 500 microns because most of your parasitic copepods are larger,
Ooh,
and she agreed with that.
great
You know,
point.
the inspections that we did on the samplings that we took, I personally didn't do it. I gave them to the experts, let them do them. We weren't coming up with anything that was really bad. You can come up with hydroids, and as a consequence, you know, when we're feeding plankton, we're dosing the tank with Panacur or fenbendazole for two reasons. The first reason is because of the potential for hydroids, but secondly, since we're feeding wild plankton, we go ahead and basically we're deworming the fry as we're feeding them.
Gotcha. And that's another good note that we hadn't really discussed at any length in this conversation is, actually caring for the fry. We were kind of focusing on just that. Cheryl, I'm curious, do you dose the tank also? Or do you just know that your cultures are clean and don't need to, or do you do it anyways to de what's your process? Did I lose her? Okay, never mind. We'll just
Well,
drop that.
I'll tell you one thing is
Okay.
that if you're buying copepods, you shouldn't be worried about the
Right.
things that I worry about with the wild stuff because, you know, if you take a look at places like Algagen is just one example. There's other producers. They go through painstaking process to get everything set up. They have to identify it. Like for example, I used to take, you know, my samples up there, and he would selectively pick out different species of copepods out of the stuff and then clean them up through his process and get the cultures going. So you shouldn't have the worry of number one, the hydroids, or number two, the potential for things like nematodes and stuff.
Gotcha. And yeah, I was hoping, I figured that's what Cheryl would say. And thank you for saying it, Dan. It's just that whenever you're listening, remember that when people are making conversations, they're talking about their circumstances, and there's usually things that might not get mentioned. For instance, if you're collecting wild, the area, the water, and treatment. That's all I wanted
Yeah.
to. Go ahead, Cheryl.
Uh, I buy from primarily reed aquaculture and also occasionally from Algebon. And these are aquacultured. Uh, Basically, there's no crap in them. And it's one of the things that you have to look at when you're looking at copepods, amphipods, or anything else. Are they, or even mysis, are they true aquacultured and clean, or do you have to worry about basically nematodes, hydroids, whatever else?
Yep. Us landlocked folks are the ones typically saying, get everything captive bred, no matter what. It has to be aquacultured. And then the folks that live in Australia might have a different opinion because their water is a little bit different than ours. And people that know how to deal with the contaminants and need a larger scale will have even a different answer. So kind of depends on your capabilities.
Yeah, it depends on whether you are basically a breeder, an aquaculturist, or are you just trying to raise stuff?
Whatever you just did, you sound fantastic now, Cheryl. At the end, great. But agreed, absolutely agreed. And you guys are having way too much fun in the comments here. Darn it, the whole conversation's going on there too. Anyhow, anything else that you guys can think of that you do that you're able to share that might help someone who's trying to start out? And again, you can mention stuff too that we
Sure.
could. Yeah, Dan, go ahead.
Temperature.
Temperature.
Yes, absolutely.
You'll find your success rates will generally be higher at lower temperatures, say in the lower 70s, and whatever that converts to, Chris, down yonder, um, than you will trying to run a tank that's in the upper 70s to low 80s.
Oh yeah, you're gonna run into Vibrio, you're gonna run into Myco at higher temps.
Um, I'm curious, Chris. Do you guys, if you're okay with answering, do you have the same situation there, or is it different due to everything? I know that wasn't a
Yeah,
very well
no,
put question, but go ahead.
definitely agree with what Ben said. Like at lower temps, things generally do better. You don't run into the same sort of bacterial problems, and if things start going south, they generally go south slower, if that makes sense. So you've generally got time to catch it and correct the problems before things get out of hand. At higher temps, things get out of hand very quickly.
Gotcha. Just wondered if you
You
guys
know,
thought the same. Go ahead.
a friend of mine who's an aquaculturist, Chris, once told me that a good aquaculturist recognizes the problem and is able to address it. A great aquaculturist recognizes the problem before it's a problem and fixes it.
Ooh,
Definitely, I like that.
And I'm the one that has to call all these guys every time. Every time. So I don't know what that says, but hey. Okay. Anything else you can think of, Dan? I don't want to. I know I said I try to keep it short tonight, so.
Keep them cold, clean your food, sterilize any food you're feeding, and do not introduce anything basically out of the wild that could contaminate your any of your cultures.
Right. And yeah, and just a little attachment to that is if you do choose to do any collecting or anything like that, Dan already mentioned earlier, some ways to deal with that. So if you go that route, make sure you have a way to make sure that the things are cleaned. But Cheryl's right on for any kind of hobbyist or someone trying to do it lower scale. Just stay away from the wild stuff for sure. Um, Anything else, guys? Anything
Something I'd
from?
probably add
Go ahead, Chris.
on temperature is consistency. So, you know, in regards to temperature, salinity, like just keep everything consistent. If you're doing like, you know, large water changes, the only reason why I get away with such large water changes that I do is because the water is temperature matched and, there's not a great disparity in salinity. Everything's very constant. And if you start getting if things start going south and you're trying to correct it with, say, water changes or whatever, you can sometimes be doing more harm than good if the salt water, is, say you've put a heap aside or you're making some up as you go and there's too much difference in the temperature or the salinity is not quite right or whatever. Large changes very quickly. Generally don't go well with any seahorses or fish. And if they're already stressed, that can sometimes tip them over the edge.
Yeah, one thing about seahorses is they do handle changes in specific gravity, which are much better than many other species of fish.
Hmm.
Uh, Typically, they are live in this environment. However, it can still mess them up if you're not careful.
Sure.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and I think we've talked about that quite a few times on the channel. Just that consistency. Very good point, Chris. Because consistency is the real deal. Even if if you're finding success at a different circumstance, just stay at that circumstance. You know what I'm saying? I mean, it's more important to have it stay the same than be all over the place trying to get it right. So like chasing pH for any reefer watching. That it's not the way to go.
One tip I always recommend for people starting out breeding is for them to figure out the system they want to, the protocols that they want to follow in terms of what they're going to do, and then stick with it all the way through the process.
Ooh, good.
Then change one thing on the next one. Don't try to change three things because now, if it works, which of the three helped? Or which of the three, or did one of the three make it worse for you?
Oh, thank
You don't
you.
know.
Oh,
Um, I've had so many people that would call me up and through the process, not even complete the batch, but through the process with the batch would change everything of what they're doing. And you're never going to know what works, what doesn't work, unless you stick to the protocol all the way through and minimize the changes each time you make a change.
And people do this all the time on saltwater tanks. And all of a sudden, everything's looking great. And then when they think back on it, they have no idea what they did that was right.
Yep. Goes right back to Chris's thoughts about keeping journal or, keeping. I know Tom Hornsby keeps like ridiculous records on in a computer program to keep track of, males, females, and just I mean, anything you could want to know about his seahorses, you can be told because he knows. But so yeah, absolutely great points, guys. And as far as the protocol, just the basics that we've covered. Can you think of anything else that you would tell your past self to include in your protocol that you did not?
Basically, makes small
I think I lost you, Cheryl.
Sounds like it.
Yeah.
One of the things I learned was to avoid the high winds.
Avoid the high winds. Right. Okay. All right.
I've never
Anything?
lost a seahorse in a hurricane, but I've had batches that I didn't do because of the hurricane.
Really?
Yes.
Oh my gosh. And that's a whole other show. But when you see the hurricanes coming, I bet there's a ton to prepare. Actually, Dan's written about that quite a few times. Check out Seahorse Source to read about his adventures with hurricanes and getting seahorse tanks ready and etc. It's crazy. But hopefully we won't have to do that this time, right? Crossing fingers. What'd the latest say?
Uh, well, right now it's so hard because you can't predict the intensity. The models aren't very good at it, and the models are all over the place, ranging from 100 knots up to 150 knots. And 150 knots, to convert that to miles per hour, you multiply it by 1.2. So that's roughly 200 mile an hour is on the high side of the
Mm.
models. And of course, we're still doing, as Mike on Mike's weather page calls it, the windshield wiper effect, where the models are flip flopping back and forth on the guidance for the tracks. Um, we're still too far out to really accurately predict the exact track. But I'll say this: anybody in the state of Florida that's anywhere from the middle of the state up should be preparing. And if this thing goes across the state like they're predicting, it's going to enter as a hurricane and exit the state as a hurricane in the Gulf, and then hit the northern part of Florida on the Panhandle. And the surge effect will affect both the east and the west coast. On the east coast, everything north of the center will have a big surge, and on the west coast, everything south of the center will have a big surge, and of course, the Panhandle will have theirs as well. There is a possibility this thing could change and go further north up into Georgia. If I was anywhere, if I lived anywhere between North Carolina to Miami, I would be watching what's going on very closely.
Mm. And just to let you, anybody who doesn't realize what we're having the conversation about right now, um, I'm headed to Magna in Florida, which is right where said possible hurricane, is headed. So, anyone in that area, of course, please take Dan's advice. And again, check out his page for the details from a few years ago when he was setting up for seahorses. But I'm pretty
The
worried.
the one th- the one thing that people who haven't experienced a real major hurricane, we've had many hurricanes down here that were not considered major hurricanes. They were Cat ones, Cat twos. When you start getting into Cat 3, Cat 4, to give you an idea, a Cat 5 hurricane does 500 times more damage than a Cat 1 does. It's not each increase in speed is not linear. It's exponentially stronger in terms of what it does for damage. And everybody talks and worries about the storm itself. The storm is scary, but the hardest part typically is the aftermath. And especially people who haven't been through it and don't understand what it's like after the storm, when you can't buy gas, when you can't use a credit card, when the simple things that you take for granted every day are simply gone. And the power is a huge issue. People in the areas where they're the highest density of people, they're going to focus on getting them back online first. People in rural areas, sometimes I've seen people go up to a month or more with no power before they got power
Oh
restored.
my gosh.
um, In our case, the average time that we've been out um, of power has been an average of 10 days. And I say that's an average because we've gone over 2 weeks without power, and we've had power back as early as 6 days.
And how do you, I promised this would be a short one, but I'm just, for anybody who happens to be listening, if they are on that in the area and they do have reef tanks, seahorse tanks, maybe even, a business that they're trying to prepare, is there any main piece of advice you can give?
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously, if you have a generator, that's going to be most helpful. The problem is if it's a portable generator, you generally can't run it during the storm. So
Mm.
our own strategy is that despite the fact that we have a portable generator, we have protected porches on opposite sides of the house. So depending upon the direction of the wind, I'll run the generator on the opposite side without a problem. And then when the wind changes, I have to kill the generator, drag it through the house to the other side. And that's pretty easy. The hard part is going outside and dragging the electric wire around over to there.
Ah,
Um, that's rather scary when I do that. Um, but I'm able to run power through the whole storm that way. And the first couple of hurricanes, we used about a dozen UPS battery backups. We used 2 car batteries with an inverter. We used 12-volt air pumps. Um, we essentially shut down almost everything. And then when we were running on generator, we were running minimal of what we had to run. So, our protein skimmers were turned off. We were running the circulation pumps and minimal lighting. The problem is that I just don't have a big enough generator. I need roughly a 20 kW generator to run everything.
jeez. And
So in an average home, it's going to be a little bit different because in the average home, we're talking a couple of tanks.
right.
So to me, a generator is cheaper than the loss of the food in a refrigerator. So I think everybody in Florida should at least have a small generator that can at least run the refrigerator and a couple of lights. Um, that goes a long way in protecting your investment in the fridge. It makes it very useful to find out what's going on, to listen to the news. Some people do have big generators that run their whole homes, and that's great if you can have that set up. But that's not the majority. That's a minority.
Right. And in the cases that you just talked about, really fast, um, did everything work out in the end? Meaning, your tips are great, and obviously you got through them. Were there any huge losses or any after effects because of the time run
No,
by generator? Really interesting.
no, we survived for Francis, Jean, Irma, um,
Mm.
Irma. What's the other one? Wilma, without any losses. We've had some tropical storms such as Faye, and I think we had tropical force winds with Matthew, and there was another one in there somewhere. We lost power for a short period of time during those. Um, but with Francis and Jean, those were 2 hurricanes that hit us within 3 weeks in the exact same spot. So we were out of power for 13 days with Francis. So we had a week of power back, and then we lost power for another 6 days after Gene passed. Um, and that was rough because at that time I didn't have everything wired. It was all extension cords, and we had humidity issues, so the floors were wet, and we had extension cords running everywhere. It was
Oh,
rather dangerous.
oh,
Uh,
yeah.
So Sam asked about the gas, and that's a very good question and a point to bring up. Is that I had a friend of mine who bought a generator, and he was very smart. Got the generator so he'd be ready for the power outage. He had a can of gas, and he found out that can of gas lasted him 12 hours, and then he couldn't get gas.
Ah,
Um, so far at the moment I have 50 gallons of gas on hand, which I got this evening, and tomorrow I will be getting an additional supply of gas, and I'll have enough to go roughly 6 days with a generator before I have to get gas.
well, that's a really good point. And I did want to. I saw Sam's other comment. Thanks so much, Sam, for hanging out and asking all these questions. As far as Macna goes, for anybody headed to Macna, I don't want anybody to not go. for this reasoning. Just to let you know, I've been in contact with Dan and a few other people, and I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Dan, but whether it's a hurricane or storm or etc., it's not even supposed to hit until Sunday or Monday, right?
Right. The people that
Okay.
are going to Magna, if you're flying home or driving home on Sunday, you should be good. If you're driving, you may encounter a lot of traffic if there's people trying to flee the state. But the flights too, if you've already got your flights booked, you're golden. But the event itself will probably happen after Sunday, or late Sunday night into Monday. We don't know exactly yet, but some of the models are calling for earlier, some as late as Tuesday. So the Magna event itself should be fine.
Okay, I'm back. Still scary. Still scary for me, especially with storms when you don't know what they're gonna do and nobody can make up their minds about what they're gonna do. And I mean, I understand you can't, but it's still just like, is there any? There's no way it could take a turn and come on Friday, right? I mean, it can't go that fast, right?
No, it won't get here on Friday. There's a
Okay.
possibility that it could get there as early as Sunday, but that that's probably not likely.
Gotcha.
Usually these things have a tendency to change a little bit, and when you look at the highs and the lows and with the potential tracks, I don't see it coming that early. I think more realistically, we're looking at a Monday event.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, yeah, I've always wanted to move to Florida, but Australia is looking better and better. Just saying.
Yeah, but if you look at hurricanes, the loss of life during hurricanes is primarily due to water. You can hide from the wind, but you can't hide from the water.
What do you mean? Flood?
Most of the lives lost during hurricanes is from drowning.
Oh, drowning. I was like, flood, really? Okay, sorry, I'm a little slow.
Yeah,
Um,
well, there's people that stay on the barrier islands, and the storm surge comes, and they don't realize that you know that water beating on a building. Some of those buildings on those barrier islands, I don't care how strong they are. You look at what Hugo did in Charleston on not James Island, on Sullivan's Island and Isle of Palms. Those islands was like somebody came along with an eraser and just erased all the buildings. I
mm,
mean, it even took out the bridge going to the islands, and that was all storm surge. The power of that water and those waves crashing on those buildings is just tremendous.
mm. It terrifies me. I don't take it lightly at all. And I see. Go ahead, Dan. Did you have more to say?
No, no, go ahead.
Okay. I mean, feel free. Chris, I'm just curious. What's the big threat out there? Is there any weather things that you deal with often? Oh,
We're actually quite lucky. We don't have, as severe with things like cyclones or hurricanes or anything like that down here. It's just
down.
bloody cold and wet and windy.
I don't know, man. I'm
Well,
pretty tempted to move. Go
well,
ahead.
so, some of your weather down there can be quite atrocious, especially on the water down where you guys are.
Yeah, it's atrocious, but you don't really have to worry about storm surges or quite as extreme wind. It's very consistent. Big cold fronts and things coming through, very very windy and that, but it's not quite the same sort of
Right.
force as a cyclone or a hurricane.
Gotcha.
There are parts of Australia that do get hit with cyclones. Am I correct?
Yeah, definitely. Further up north, places like Cairns, Brisbane, Northern Territory, Darwin, yeah, up the top end.
Sam's in the comments saying we get bad weather, but no,
Yeah,
I'm glad to hear that you don't get it as bad. That's good. I'm so glad to hear it. I'd hate to see anything
I'm very
bad.
lucky.
Yes, I mean I'm over here in Indiana. I'm like we get a tornado now and then, but that's about it. But you guys get the wonderful weather when it's wonderful. What I this is totally off the subject, but what's the best place to live where you can have the weather and not the storms? Is there anywhere? Nobody knows.
Well,
Okay.
actually, if you look at certain parts of Central America, there's places where they almost never get hit.
Really?
There's different holes that the circumnavigators or the people that typically live in the Caribbean on sailboats will move to during the season to get out of the path of the hurricanes.
Wow. Well, and I just have to make a shout out to said Macna folks. And love you, and I'm gonna keep coming no matter what. But it would really be fantastic if we could start planning this in a time that wasn't mid hurricane. This is like the second Macna where I've barely missed a hurricane, and I don't want to meet one. I really, really don't. Hawaii, Kim. I'm coming to Hawaii. I like it, and I do see that a bunch of you just joined or are now speaking up. If you have any questions for, we were kind of talking about fry and the differences. Cheryl gave us a good talk on raising pelagic species, and as did Chris, and we've just kind of talked about that kind of stuff. If you have any questions for Chris or for Dan, who's left, ask them quickly because I didn't want to keep everybody up all night tonight, and I appreciate so much when you guys come. So, yeah, the volcanoes take care of everything. Oh, Lord. I don't want volcanoes either. Well, they don't erupt anymore, do they? Okay, that was a dumb question.
Yes.
Never mind. Never mind. Okay, I'm just going to stay in Indiana. Screw it. I'll come visit y'all in the non-bad times. Chris, I really value the fact that you took time to come tonight. And is there anything that I missed asking you about or that you wanted to share? Or
Not really. Lots of exciting things coming up, but nothing that I can officially announce, which sucks.
Yeah, we'll come back and announce when you can. But
Lots of things on the horizon.
what did you say?
Lots of exciting things on the horizon, just nothing that I'm allowed to announce,
I hear
which
you.
hurts.
Well, guys, that means keep your eyes on Seahorse Australia. Things are coming. Very excited. I want to visit just to come see. Dan, I don't know if I ever told you this, but they put a restaurant on top. Is it on top, Chris?
Yeah,
Of
on top.
It's awesome. I love it. I think it's such a good idea. So they have a restaurant they're running now too, in addition to the tours and the breeding and everything else. Very, very cool. Well, okay, we'll come back and announce anything you can think of, and I really appreciate you coming and sharing your thoughts and tips and etc. Cheryl, I know you got kind of kicked off there at the end. Thank you so much for joining in. Sorry we had phone troubles, guys. That was my fault. We meant to get set up earlier, and the link didn't work, and so she kind of came in at the last minute. So maybe next time Cheryl joins, we'll get her set up properly so you can hear her better. Sorry. Dan, anything else you wanted to say?
Prepare and duck.
Prepare and duck, everybody in Florida. Prepare and duck. Oh, Lord. All right, I already emptied the glass, so I'm going to call it, guys. Unless I missed any other questions, I don't think so, but we will be back next week and hopefully have some more fun chats. Guests coming too. So you guys say bye, and then I will.
Bye.
Chris says bye.
Thanks for having us, guys.
What'd you say?
Always good to be on. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for
We
coming,
enjoy ya.
Chris. All right. Cheers, guys. Happy Wine Wednesday. Cheers.
Good night.